Weathering is many things. It's a marriage between two materials. It's a reflection of life. It's a documentation of memories, history, interaction. Weathering is not just an aesthetic. The chapter on weathering refers to weathering as a finish, but to me, finish implies anthropogenic involvement. While one could consider weathering as a finish of the environment, that seems to disassociate it from its societal implications. In its indigenous form, weathering occurs where sometimes care cannot afford to be taken. But that doesn't mean care doesn't exist there. To consider weathering purely as a design tool is a privilege. Weathering was originally used to describe the architectural elements that controlled the effects weather would have on a building. It accepted weathering as inevitable and worked with it. With modernization came weatherproofing in an attempt to eliminate weathering as an effect. Deterioration is a part of life, whether that's organic life or the life of an object. Is it not arrogant to try and create something to withstand time and nature? Why try to fight against the inevitable instead of weaving it into the narrative of the architecture and leaving it as an unfinished, forever-changing project? Isn't that more interesting than a static, stagnant piece? Weathering provides architecture with shadows permanently embedded within its fabric. I really like this quote because without shadows, one can't appreciate the light, and weathering is often found in the shadows. I think that to champion purity and pristineness in architecture sends a message of classism. Instead, consider weathering as a process that can positively transform a building over time. The chapter describes how Scarpa intentionally set up the means for the weathering of his building with the idea that dirt and buildings are both part of the Earth's fabric, and one is not necessarily better than the other. A pristine building that withstands time is not necessarily better than the one that shows signs of a life lived. This allowance and acceptance of weathering is more accessible, in part because it requires a certain upkeep to maintain the white standard of cleanliness and precision. It got me thinking about the Mill 19 site, where the weathering of the factory reflects the tenacity of those who worked beneath the steel beams. Weathering doesn't have to be the opposite of purity and health and morality. It doesn't have to be black and white. Architecture has a reputation for being a bit inaccessible and unapproachable for the general public, and I believe that weathering can be the bridge to fill that gap. That being said, is there an inauthenticity to intentional curated weathering compared to indigenous weathering? Should graffiti be considered weathering since it captured a lived moment in time? Weathering is many things. It's a reminder of the past, it's evidence of a future, it's a world builder. There's a weight to weathering that needs to be considered. I think that it can really tell a story, whether it's one of the past or of the future. Who knows how the endgame of the studio will turn out? But we're going to take it day by day and produce something authentic, something that respects the treatment and all that it encompasses. And we're starting this week. On the first day of class, Gerard talked about understanding the memories and identities attached to place, and using care to reimagine materiality. I've chosen to investigate weathering through 4 everyday accessible materials to explore the difference between lack of care and weathering. These objects have frequent interactions with anthropogenic activity since they're built into our everyday lives, and despite being commonplace, should have memories attached. As an added bonus, they also all contain layered elements, so they may weather differently compared to other materials. The weathering I'll enact on materials will be tailored to each one based on the natural conditions it would endure. The first material is fabric, in particular sari fabric. As one of the oldest unstitched garments in the world, I would say there's a lot of memories and identities to be found here. The nature of the sari allows for a lot of diversity, both in style and use. There are more than 108 different ways of draping the garment on the body and countless functions outside of fashion as well, including architecture and design. Saris can be passed down from generation to generation, and as something that endures so much, I'm interested in seeing how it weathers and how the layering of the fabric affects the process. The fabric I'm using is a donated sari, so the aging process has already begun. The material is quite thin, but seems to be fairly strong. With enough force, it will definitely rip, but should be able to withstand wear and tear. There's an existing luster to the fabric as well, on both the plain and embellished parts. Each strip I've cut is folded into a different number of layers, so we shall see if the layering affects durability. Since this material is primarily worn on the body, I'll be putting it in environments and conditions that a human wearing the fabric would be in normally, so these processes would most likely be testing physical durability. I think it'll definitely get stained and start to lose its luster. Depending on what I put it through, it may or may not rip, but we'll have to see. The second material is plywood. Plywood is something that can be found in almost any built environment and comes in a variety of thicknesses with varying degrees of strength. The piece I've chosen to use is a 1-inch thick, solid piece of untreated plywood. I'll be experimenting with expansion and contraction with this one. Whether that includes just sun and water, or if we'll delve into cars and freezers, we'll have to see. I'm interested in seeing how the alternating grain patterns will come into play. I expect to see some warping and swelling, and possible discoloration depending on what the weather's like. The third material is hydraulic expansion cement mixed with a rigid foam insulation as aggregate. The cement interests me as a material because it's something that was created very quickly and has a long lifespan. It's pretty durable, but depending on how it's cast, it can be more or less fragile. I cast a pretty solid chunk, so hopefully it'll endure the investigation. The foam ideally should have been mixed in as aggregate, but it floated to the top every time, so this is what we're working with. I think it would be interesting to experiment with acid rain dupes and various erosion processes for this one. I can see some surface wear and tear happening, as well as the softening of the edges over time. The foam bits seem fragile and may start to break down at some point. And last but not least, we have a 1/2-inch piece of drywall. Considering it's pretty standard building material, drywall's pretty fragile. Or maybe I'm just weak. Either way, it's safe to say we all come into contact with some. For this one, I think I'm leaning towards humidity and moisture tests. Just like the previous three, the layering of this material will come into play in how it weathers. Well, the materials are prepped and the ideas are flowing, so I'm excited to see where it will end up. Happy weathering!